talk is, does the right to life entail a right to die? The subtitle is probably Promoting and Protecting the Right to Life. And I see my task here is one of assisting you and those people who can influence others to be convincing on these matters at this important time in the life of this very important document that we've been hearing about. The notion of convincing has to do with evidence. It also has to do with cognitional skill, so that people are convinced if you have good evidence for arguments. And if you don't have good evidence, it is not convincing. Okay. Sorry. The talk is also about technology. So, should I speak from here?
Yannick, you can stay there, Yannick.
So I speak from the perspective of a family physician who cares for people with developmental disabilities in Canada. And I consider it a privilege to give voice to their perspective in the discussion today. I also speak as an ethicist who has had the privilege of participating on 3 national ethics bodies in Canada: the Canadian College of Family Physicians, the Canadian Medical Society, and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, during the important time in our country when this issue was being discussed and debated. I'm here actually to talk about the situation of convincing others, and I must admit that I was unable to convince my colleagues that this right to life did not include the extension to the right to die. In Canada, the typical way that this is talked about is euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. It's almost always euthanasia. And so, since physician-assisted suicide is so rarely offered in Canada, even though it is legal, for this presentation, I will just speak about euthanasia. As a physician who cares for people with intellectual disabilities, myself and others were shocked to discover that the renowned physician who was important in discovering autism, Hans Asperger, was in fact alleged to have himself collaborated with the euthanasia program involving children with disabilities during the Second World War. I guess it just raises the question for us in Canada about how we will be judged. Next. So we've heard very eloquently today about this Universal Declaration, that it was adopted after the violence of the Second World War and the extermination of people deemed to be unfit or unworthy of life. It reflected a broad consensus that such disregard for human life ought never occur. We have heard already terms such as facilitating the termination of life, or euthanasia referred to as medical treatment. And so this is actually what I'm going to argue is not only inconsistent with the notion that underpins the Declaration, but radically at odds. Just a little point of information. I'm also speaking to defend the very good work of a fellow Canadian who in 1948 actually was the main writer of this document. Next. So during these 70 years, medical science and technology, supported by social and economic interests, increasingly are reframing human life to mean something that is under human control and study, to manipulate and to change. As Dr. Martin had mentioned earlier, the term squeezing life out of life comes to mind. At the same time, in these last 70 years, through the medicalization of death, as described by such thinkers as Philippe Erez and Ivan Illich, our capacity as a society to accept human limitation and mortality and to find meaning in these things, including suffering, has not been increasing. Suffering and death are things that many people now expect medicine to be able to address, rather than religion. So it's in this historical and cultural context that proponents of euthanasia have been attempting to reframe the right to life to include the so-called right to die. This reasoning in Canada persuaded our Supreme Court to decriminalize euthanasia under certain conditions in Canadian law. And this is just the argument that was used to persuade the court that this was in fact a right to life, so that people with, it was a specific case of somebody with a degenerative neurological condition that claimed that if she did not have assistance at some future date to end her life, she would end her life prematurely by suicide under her own means. And so this became a right to life that was persuasive. So in this presentation, I am urging those here to convince member states to resist this misframing of this basic human right to life. So it's all about framing. So I will argue that such a reframing is not a development, but rather is dialectically opposed to the framework of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And by reframing it, it introduces not development, but decline. The emphasis that we've heard throughout this session is on what is meant by inherent human dignity that all members of the human family enjoy as the first and most basic of their human rights. What I will do is spell out some philosophical assumptions and some empirical claims that underline this reframing, which I think should not be regarded as convincing. And I'll conclude with 4 practical recommendations that ways that member states can reaffirm their commitment to the principles underlying the Universal Declaration. The first, in my paper, I actually unpack what it means to claim there is a right to die, and I spell out it's actually a series of claims. And so what I'm going to do very quickly is highlight what the propositions are. So the first proposition might be expressed like this: is life inviolable, or is it similar to property? Is that how we should understand it? Another way of saying this is the dignity of life inherent or intrinsic, or is it attributed? So how did proponents of euthanasia reframe the right to life as entailing this right to die? They have assumed that persons have a right to die when and how they choose. What is the philosophical assumption behind this claim? That their lives can be treated like property. And this is very much consistent with what Professor Gregor Pupin pointed out in this notion of the assertion of the human will over the body viewed simply as material. However, No human gives themselves their life. It is a gift. It's not the property of the person who owns it, nor the property of another person, nor of the state. The Universal Declaration is founded on the principle that every human life has inherent dignity. If you regard it as a property, then such dignity is attributed by the owner of that property. So then you speak about attributed dignity. So the question is dignity inherent or is it attributed? And these two notions are not compatible. They are dialectically opposed. And so you have to make a decision. And the claim that I would highlight is that only the position that life has inherent dignity is sufficiently solid to ground respect for every human being's right to life as inviolable. The second philosophical assumption in these claims that proponents of this alleged right to die assume is that to remove barriers to exercising this right, the states are required to ensure that some of their citizens assist people with suicidal intentions without risking any criminal liability. Such assistants, unfortunately, are often physicians. However, if states require physicians who oppose euthanasia to undertake or to cooperate with these practices, this would actually contravene Article 18 of the same declaration. This article points out that the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is a human right. As we heard in the case of abortion, the states are already violating this right for places where this is legalized. So for instance, where I am from, Ontario, Canada, our College of Physicians and Surgeons has stipulated that every physician when asked by a patient for access to euthanasia, has to make an effective referral. So the concerns about cooperation arise. So even if the physician is opposed, they are at risk of losing their license for such opposition. And the court, we took the college to court, and the court ruled against those conscientious objectors by saying that they thought it was a justified violation of the physician's right to freedom of conscience. I'll refer you to the Nuremberg Charter on this matter later. Moreover, the effects of decriminalizing euthanasia on the medical profession, especially palliative care, have been divisive. Many palliative care physicians, patients, and families are confused and distressed that the philosophy on which palliative care was founded has been reframed as a result of this permissive legislation. In other words, this connection between the law and how we view reality. So what's actually happened is the court has said that most philosophers believe that intention is not important on these matters. So intention is out the window, and it's no longer considered to be ethically relevant. So the foundational palliative care principle of neither prolonging life nor hastening death has been undermined. So my final claim, and this is kind of a philosophical claim, that's being made is it's better to be dead than disabled. So let's just think about that for a minute. Proponents of the alleged right to die argue that under certain conditions, being dead is better than being alive, especially when such a life involves current or anticipated disabilities that the person would find intolerable to cope with. So I'd like to make 5 claims to oppose this claim before concluding. First, Better dead than disabled assumes that after death, there is nothing. It's a blank screen. People will recognize this from the airport at Geneva. There is no ultimate accountability. This assumes a materialist notion of reality that in fact is uncertain. Moreover, it's the view that's not held by the vast majority of humanity. What happens in Canada is the 10% who believe this are in positions to say that anybody who doesn't believe this is no longer to be believed because they're not objective. This is our Royal Society of Canada who's made this claim. So we're the only ones with authority to speak on this because we're objective. Next. The second problem with this position, better dead than disabled, is what that says by society to people with disabilities. And I show this image of someone from Canada named Dennis Kay, who wrote a book. And he wrote this book at the same time as someone else with the same condition was the chief proponent of changing the law on euthanasia because of her disability. So basically what he said is that when there's attributions of dignity that are being made, they're not strictly personal. They do have implications for the lives of others with similar disabilities. So what he said was that he was concerned that if public policy validates the principle, better dead than disabled, there will be less emphasis placed in healthcare and society on helping to support people with disabilities and enabling them to accept and cope with their disabilities through good care. Better dead than disabled reinforces the view that life with a disability is worth less than life without one. I just want to put that image up there for a minute and see what people think. The third point is that some have argued that the lack of state intervention to terminate a person with serious illness or disability's life on request amounts to the state extending and thus contributing to that person's suffering. Next. Sometimes it's not so easy to appreciate suffering, what that looks like. Such arguments overlook the reality that the healthcare system, economic and social and other circumstances, such as the lack of support that might be needed by somebody with a disability, the lack of proactive interventions to address a person's isolation, their poverty, their lack of control over their lives, all of these things are to a large extent what's causing the person's suffering. The prior image was actually about from the waterfront here in Geneva by Albert Gorgi, and the sculpture is called Melancholia. Melancholy, black humor. I want to flag that this is actually not about just the end of life. It's about a transition that we all will travel, if we live long enough, to later phases of life and to accepting the issues that come along with that, as well as the opportunities. But the state's intervention to terminate a life on the basis of a right to die signals the failure of its positive obligation to ensure conditions necessary for protecting the right to life and promoting its flourishing among people who are coping with the transition to experiencing disability in their lives, which is most people here in this room. We will be in that life phase transition. And this takes time, and it takes adequate supports. The image here is actually by an artist. His name is Mikhail Kimakin, if I pronounce that correctly. It's in Moscow. It's about children who are basically transitioning to adulthood and are the victims, often, of adult vices. So all these images around these children are to represent various vices, drugs, war, and so on. I would like to commission another work about adults transitioning to later life phases and what all the sort of the vices that they're prone to. Fourth, a lot of talk about safeguards. And in Canada, that was the decisive empirical question which turned the tide, that there are safeguards. We're going to put out safeguards, and they're going to be able to control the abuse of this policy. But as this paper points out, even with general safeguards and criteria, laws that permit euthanasia under certain conditions are, in practice, often insufficient to deal with the complexities of assessing decision-making capacity or the severity of suffering of many people with disabilities, and I would say others. The state's obligation under the Universal Declaration to protect the right to life of these vulnerable persons is often not observed in countries where there is permissive legislation. For instance, this recent review of a series of 9 cases of people with disabilities from the Netherlands points out how difficult it is to assess somebody with a disability. And in fact, they point out that in many cases, the physicians assumed intolerable or irremediable suffering on the basis of the person basically having an intellectual or developmental disability or autism. And often did not look to comorbidities such as depression or other things. The other thing that was significant was there was very little discussion to make sure they understood that there were alternative courses of action. And in all these cases, the person was by themselves. As you say, we're relational, right? Person with a disability by themselves making this decision is problematic, to say the least. A fifth issue that came up and was never talked about, or very rarely talked about until after this became law, was the financial or economic benefit for in a single payer system of this policy. So where states are also the funder and provider of healthcare services, there can be a serious conflict of interest in laws recognizing this right to die. Studies such as this one show that death by euthanasia represent considerable cost savings over the costs of supporting people with disabilities and chronic illnesses. So let me conclude with 4 practical recommendations that I'm just proposing that you can carry forward. So on the basis of this analysis, I would offer these practical recommendations for states. First, it's about a competency. So I talked about these philosophical issues, but there's also empirical issues like assessing risk in the context of a policy. So to develop these competencies to affirm the inherent dignity and worth of every human life and oppose claims that the right to die is a human right consistent with the framework of the Universal Declaration. And I would point to, as resources for people, to the Pontifical Academy's website, as well as to the International Association of Catholic Bioethicists. Second, to sponsor investigations into empirical questions relevant to euthanasia, such as social and economic factors that are contributing to requests for these practices that states can and should ameliorate. So why is the person asking? Do we know what the reasons are? It's as broad as the reasons for why people commit suicide. So what is the relationship between request for euthanasia and suicide? Is a request itself a suicidal behavior? And there's a whole protocol of approaching people who are suicidal. This is regarded mostly in Canada as a very separate issue. Is it? And then what is the role and impact on families and other caregivers? I was part of an international study that reviewed publications, not just in English, around the world prior to this legislation, and it was remarkable that there were no studies on the effect of families. And here we go ahead, we're relational beings, we go ahead with a policy without knowing that. It's problematic, but that's a responsibility of government. Third, develop, monitor, and manage regulations that promote and protect the fundamental right to life, especially of people with disabilities and other groups that are made vulnerable by permitting euthanasia. And I would refer people to a Canadian source. I've been working with a number of colleagues across Canada to publish something called the Vulnerable Persons Standard. And it incorporates 5 evidence-based safeguards to ensure protection of lives of vulnerable persons who may be subject to coercion, inducement to suicide, and abuse. So it is actually a way to assess a legal regime and to see what their safeguards are. You know, you fly Air Canada, they always begin by saying, our #1 priority is your safety. So this is also a safety issue. Finally, vigorously support as an appropriate and necessary extension of the human right to life, the right to good palliative care for any who need it. And I would refer you to an excellent joint statement on that. Thanks. So, on a final note, I'd like to highlight for our consideration the approach that St. Francis de Sales, the Catholic Archbishop of Geneva during the Reformation, took as a model that we might emulate for engaging others on the divisive issue of euthanasia. As many of you here will know, he founded the Académie Florentine as a peaceful gathering for people of culture and learning to engage in debates of the questions of the day. And at the time of the Reformation, these were pretty serious questions and led to war, right? People that disagree on these fundamental issues, that can be a source of war. And he offered the outcomes of those debates publicly. This is actually something that we try to do in the International Association of Catholic Bioethics. And finally, on this 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, let us continue to affirm the inherent dignity of every human life. It is too important an ethical achievement to be discarded as yesterday's news. Thank you very much.